How I took down my uncle after he tried to destroy our family legacy. When my grandfather passed away, everyone expected my Uncle Mark to take over the family farm. It wasn't just any farm, it was our legacy, nearly 100 years old, land passed down through generations, full of sweat, stories, and sacrifice. Mark was the oldest son, so most people assumed it was his by default. But here's the thing. Mark barely set foot on that farm. My dad was the one who'd spent years running it, waking up before dawn every day, fixing fences, feeding animals, dealing with equipment breakdowns, and navigating endless red tape. Dad didn't just live on the farm, he lived for that farm. Mark, on the other hand, lived in the city. Fancy restaurants, business meetings, weekend trips. The farm was just a name to him, a potential payday waiting to happen. After Grandpa died, Mark wasted zero time making his move. He sweet-talked Grandma into signing over her share of the property rights, promising to take care of everything. That was the first red flag, but Grandma trusted him. She always did. Within weeks, Mark started selling off equipment without telling anyone. Old tractors, the irrigation system, even the livestock. He laid off the few workers who'd been with the farm for decades, men who knew every inch of that land. He didn't care about the farm's future, only the cash in his pocket. Dad and I begged Mark to reconsider. We reminded him what Grandpa had built, the hard work, the blood, sweat, and tears. But Mark shut us out. No meetings, no calls returned. He acted like we were trespassers on what he now claimed was his property. Then came the legal moves. Mark filed paperwork declaring himself the sole owner of the farm and sent us eviction notices. If we didn't leave within 30 days, he threatened, he'd call the sheriff. We were blindsided, broke, and desperate. Dad was heartbroken, and I felt helpless watching the farm we'd cared for crumble in someone else's hands. But giving up? That was never an option. I realized pretty quickly that fighting Mark's slick legal team head-on wasn't going to work. They had money, connections, and the kind of lawyers who knew all the tricks. My family had none of that, so I started looking for a different way to fight back, a way Mark wouldn't see coming. First, I reached out to everyone who had ever worked on the farm or knew Grandpa well. Old friends, retired workers, local business owners, anyone who could back up my dad's story about the farm's ownership and the family's history. It took weeks of calls and visits, but slowly people started talking. One former farmhand who'd been there for decades told me stories about how Grandpa had specifically made sure the farm would stay in my dad's care. Another neighbor confirmed that Grandma had never wanted to sign over her share to Mark, but he'd pressured her. While I was gathering this, I also started digging into Mark's personal life. It was ugly. Despite his fancy lifestyle, Mark was drowning in debt. I found out through public records and a few discreet conversations that he'd maxed out credit cards, had several unpaid loans, and worst of all, had a gambling addiction that was bleeding him dry. His business deals were fake investments or scams, and he was desperate for quick cash. The farm was just collateral in his eyes, a way to pay off his debts and keep up appearances. I gathered all this info and met with a lawyer who specialized in estate fraud and family disputes. We started putting together a case to expose Mark's lies and desperation. When the court hearings began, Mark tried to keep up his act. He cried on cue, told half-truths, and painted himself as the victim. But every time he opened his mouth, we had documents, witnesses, and facts to shut him down. The judge wasn't convinced by Mark's story. An audit was ordered and his finances came under a microscope. The audit was the beginning of the end for Mark. The court uncovered a web of financial mess. Unpaid debts, forged documents, and suspicious transactions linked to companies he secretly controlled. Worse, there was clear evidence that he'd pressured Grandma into signing paperwork she never fully understood. With the weight of the evidence piling up, The judge ruled in our favor. The ownership of the farm was legally restored to my family, and Mark's claim was dismissed entirely. But the legal victory was just part of the story. Mark's reputation in town was shattered. Word got out about his lies, gambling addiction, and how he tried to steal a family legacy for his own gain. Old friends turned their backs. Business contacts stopped returning his calls. The man who once walked into every room with an air of confidence now found himself isolated and ignored. I didn't stop there. Knowing how desperate Mark was, I worked with prosecutors to expose the fraud and coercion. He faced charges for forging documents and financial mismanagement. The court ordered him to pay hefty fines and restitution. Meanwhile, my dad and I worked to repair the damage Mark left behind. We rehired workers, repaired the fences, and slowly brought the farm back to life. The community, seeing our dedication, rallied around us. Neighbors offered help, local businesses gave discounts on supplies, and volunteers showed up on weekends. The farm wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It was a symbol of resilience and family strength. What truly drove the final nail in Mark's coffin wasn't just the court or the community. It was how I handled the aftermath. Instead of gloating or rubbing his failure in his face, I focused on showing what loyalty and family really meant. I made sure that every part of the farm was restored, every worker who'd been fired got their job back, and my dad's dream of preserving Grandpa's legacy stayed alive. Mark tried to claw his way back, sending desperate messages and promises to change. But no one wanted to hear from him anymore. His calls went unanswered, and his attempts to rebuild relationships fell flat. The family gatherings he once dominated became events he wasn't invited to. Birthdays, holidays, even the small Sunday dinners. Mark was on the outside looking in. His financial ruin followed him. The gambling debts caught up, and with no family support, he hit rock bottom. Meanwhile, my dad found peace. The farm thrived again. We planted new crops, fixed broken fences, and even started a small farmer's market booth selling fresh produce. I found a new sense of purpose, too, not just as my dad's son, but as someone who stood up against betrayal and fought for what was right. The farm wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about honor, loyalty, and fighting back against the people who tried to tear your family apart. Mark's downfall was complete. He lost the farm, his reputation, and his family's trust. There was no redemption for him, no second chance. I don't say this to boast or to celebrate someone else's misery. I say it because sometimes family isn't about blood or titles. It's about loyalty, hard work, and standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. I'm proud to say that the farm is in my family's hands again. It's not perfect. We still have a lot to rebuild, but it's ours. Grandpa's legacy lives on, not because of a will or a legal document, but because we refuse to let it die. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's that betrayal cuts deep, but it can also light a fire. When someone tries to tear your family apart, you don't have to crumble. You fight back, cold, calculated, and unrelenting. Mark thought he could take everything from us. He was wrong.